Have you ever been absolutely certain about something, only to discover later you were spectacularly wrong? Think about this. A man walks into a bank in broad daylight, face smeared with lemon juice, utterly convinced he's invisible to security cameras. When police arrest him hours later, he's genuinely shocked. "But I wore the juice," he protests, bewildered that his invisibility failed him. This isn't a thought experiment. This is the true story of McArthur Wheeler, whose spectacularly failed 1995 bank robbery sparked one of psychology's most profound insights into human cognition. That bewildering disconnect between absolute certainty and absolute incompetence reveals a cognitive abyss that lurks within all our minds. You stand at its edge every time you venture into unfamiliar territory, though you may not recognize the danger. We all inhabit this territory of the Dunning-Kruger effect, where ignorance doesn't merely exist, but disguises itself as expertise, where incompetence wears the mask of mastery, and where those who know the least often speak with the greatest conviction. When psychologist David Dunning first heard about Wheeler's lemon juice invisibility theory, he wasn't merely amused, he was intellectually captivated. How could someone's self-assessment be so catastrophically misaligned with reality? The question haunted him. Working with his graduate student Justin Kruger, Dunning designed experiments to probe this strange disconnect between perceived and actual competence. Their groundbreaking study revealed a pattern so consistent it has since been replicated across countless domains. Those performing in the bottom quartile dramatically overestimated their abilities, believing they outperformed most of their peers, when in reality they had barely outperformed anyone. Meanwhile, top performers consistently underestimated their relative standing. Does this sound familiar in your own experience? Have you ever been surprised to discover someone's inflated sense of their own abilities? Or perhaps recognized it in yourself? What Dunning and Kruger had identified wasn't simply overconfidence, it was a specific metacognitive deficiency. If you're incompetent, Dunning observed, you can't know you're incompetent. The very knowledge structures needed to recognize competence are the same ones needed to produce competence. Without them, you're trapped in a cognitive prison of your own making, unable to even see the bars. Picture the novice chess player who believes they've discovered an unbeatable opening strategy, unaware that grandmasters explored and discarded it centuries ago. Or imagine the first-year medical student who feels ready to diagnose patients after a single anatomy course. These aren't merely cases of hubris, they represent fundamental failures of metacognition, the ability to know what you know and what you don't. How often do you question the boundaries of your own knowledge? This effect isn't a personality flaw or cognitive defect. Rather, it emerges naturally from the structure of learning itself, a necessary consequence of how knowledge is acquired and assessed. This architectural inevitability operates through several interlocking mechanisms that might be operating in your mind right now. First among these is the unknown unknowns problem. When you enter a new domain, your ignorance is twofold. You lack knowledge of the subject matter, but you also lack knowledge of what constitutes knowledge in that domain. You don't just not know. You don't know what you don't know. Without a mental map of the territory, you mistake the small clearing you stand in for the entire landscape. Think about the last time you began learning something new. Did you recognize how vast the field was, or did it seem simpler than it actually is? This blindness is then reinforced by confirmation bias. your tendency to seek evidence that supports your existing beliefs while ignoring contradictory information. A novice programmer who writes their first functioning code may feel they've mastered a language, selectively attending to what worked while remaining blind to inefficiencies, security vulnerabilities, and best practices they've violated. Each small success feels like confirmation of broader mastery. How might this be happening in areas where you feel confident? Finally, we struggle with calibration, accurately comparing our performance against appropriate benchmarks. Without clear external feedback, we default to seeing ourselves as above average, a statistical impossibility when applied across a population, but a nearly universal human tendency. Ask yourself, in how many domains do you consider yourself above average? Statistically speaking, that can't be true for all of them. These mechanisms don't operate in isolation, but form a self-reinforcing cycle that can be remarkably resistant to correction. As philosopher Bertrand Russell noted, the whole problem with the world is that fools and fanatics are always so certain of themselves, but wiser people so full of doubts. This isn't coincidence, but causation. The same cognitive structures that produce wisdom also generate appropriate uncertainty. Which side of this equation do you most often find yourself on? Your path from novice to expert isn't a simple linear progression, but a psychological odyssey with distinct emotional landscapes. Initially, you ascend what's colloquially called Mount Stupid, that treacherous peak of overconfidence where minimal knowledge creates maximum certainty. Here, you feel enlightened, having grasped a few basic concepts without yet encountering the complexities that would temper your confidence. Can you recall a time when you stood atop this mountain, convinced of your mastery after learning just the basics? The descent from this peak can be traumatic. As learning continues, you enter the valley of despair, where the initial illusion of mastery shatters against the rocks of complexity. Here, many abandon their journey, unable to reconcile their self-image with newly discovered limitations. This valley represents the most dangerous point in the learning trajectory, when confidence collapses, but competence hasn't yet risen to take its place. Have you ever felt this intellectual vertigo when realizing how much you didn't know? For those who persevere through this psychological crucible, the climb up the slope of enlightenment begins. Here, your confidence and competence grow in closer alignment, with each new understanding properly contextualized within an increasingly sophisticated mental framework. Progress feels slower, but builds on firmer foundations. Where on this journey do you find yourself in the areas that matter most to you? Eventually, true masters reach the plateau of sustainability, where high competence is matched with calibrated confidence. What's fascinating is that at this level, slight underconfidence often emerges, a phenomenon called expert's uncertainty. Those with the deepest understanding of a domain become intimately familiar with its complexities, edge cases, and unanswered questions. They know exactly how much remains unknown. As physicist Richard Feynman observed, I think it's much more interesting to live not knowing than to have answers that might be wrong. This intellectual humility represents the true culmination of the knowledge journey. Not perfect certainty, but perfect calibration between knowledge and confidence. Can you recognize this quality in the true experts you've encountered? The Dunning-Kruger effect isn't merely an academic curiosity. It shapes your world in profound and sometimes dangerous ways. Its fingerprints can be found on catastrophic business decisions, medical errors, political polarization, and countless everyday interactions you witness or participate in. In your professional environment, it might manifest as the team member who dominates discussions despite limited understanding, or the manager who resists advice from more experienced subordinates. One study found that 95% of managers believe they perform in the top half of their peer group, a statistical impossibility that reveals how pervasive this bias remains, even among educated professionals. Do any of your colleagues, or perhaps you yourself, fall into this trap? The healthcare domain offers particularly sobering examples. Research shows that physicians who express the highest confidence in their diagnoses are no more accurate than their peers, but significantly less likely to seek second opinions or consult reference materials. This overconfidence directly impacts patient outcomes, with diagnostic errors contributing to approximately 10% of patient deaths. Would you want your doctor to be absolutely certain or appropriately cautious? Perhaps nowhere is the effect more visible than in the political discourse that surrounds you daily, where complex policy questions requiring nuanced expertise are reduced to absolutist positions held with unwavering certainty. Those with the least sophisticated understanding of economics, climate science, or geopolitics often express the greatest confidence in their solutions, while actual experts acknowledge trade-offs, limitations, and uncertainties. How often do you encounter this phenomenon in public debate? Your digital landscape has amplified these tendencies to unprecedented levels. Social media platforms democratize voice without democratizing expertise, allowing everyone equal opportunity to broadcast opinions regardless of knowledge. Algorithms often favor confident, provocative statements over nuanced analysis, creating what researchers call an expertise crisis, where the distinction between novice and expert perspectives blurs into irrelevance. How do you distinguish between genuine expertise and confident posturing in your information diet? As Neil deGrasse Tyson succinctly puts it, one of the great challenges in this world is knowing enough about a subject to think you're right, but not enough about the subject to know you're wrong. This precarious position, knowing just enough to feel informed without knowing enough to recognize limitations, defines much of our modern discourse. Where might you be vulnerable to this trap? The expression of the Dunning-Kruger effect isn't universal, but filtered through cultural lenses that profoundly influence how you evaluate yourself and others. These cultural variations reveal that while metacognitive challenges may be hardwired into human cognition, their manifestation remains culturally contingent. If you were raised in Western, particularly American culture, you've likely been steeped in messages emphasizing self-promotion, optimism, and confidence from early childhood. You can be anything you want, children are told, creating fertile ground for positive self-assessment, regardless of objective performance. This cultural endorsement of self-belief may inadvertently amplify the Dunning-Kruger effect by normalizing confidence that exceeds competence. How might your cultural background shape your self-assessment tendencies? By contrast, if you were raised in many East Asian cultures, you might have internalized an emphasis on self-improvement through self-criticism. Japanese students typically rate themselves below average on various dimensions, an inversion of the Western above-average effect. This cultural tendency toward critical self-assessment may serve as a partial inoculation against the worst excesses of the Dunning-Kruger effect by encouraging more conservative self-evaluation. What cultural forces shape your assessment of your own abilities? The collectivist-individualist spectrum further shapes how the effect operates in your social environment. In more collectivist societies, where group harmony and interdependence are prioritized, feedback flows more freely between individuals, and maintaining unrealistic self-assessments becomes harder when group consensus contradicts them. As Confucius noted, real knowledge is to know the extent of one's ignorance. A philosophy embedded in educational systems that naturally cultivates metacognitive awareness. How does your social circle influence your self-perception? Yet while cultural factors modulate the effect's expression, no society completely escapes the fundamental cognitive architecture that creates it. The universal challenge of not knowing what you don't know transcends cultural boundaries, even as its manifestation varies across societies. The Dunning-Kruger effect presents you with a paradox. Confidence can be both essential for achievement and a warning sign of incompetence. How do you navigate this contradiction? How do you cultivate the confidence needed for action without falling into the trap of overconfidence? Research suggests that optimal performance requires calibrated confidence, self-belief aligned with reality. Too little confidence prevents action. Too much prevents learning. Performance psychologists have identified a sweet spot where confidence enables persistence while remaining flexible enough to incorporate feedback and recognize limitations. Where do you fall on this spectrum in different areas of your life? Interestingly, studies indicate that slight overconfidence, just enough to prompt action but not enough to blind you to reality, may actually be beneficial. This mild positive illusion can increase motivation and resilience, helping overcome initial obstacles. The problem emerges when this healthy margin of overconfidence balloons into the dramatic miscalibration characteristic of the Dunning-Kruger effect. How might you foster this productive level of confidence without tipping into delusion? As psychologist Albert Bandura noted, people who have a sense of self-efficacy bounce back from failures. They approach things in terms of how to handle them rather than worrying about what can go wrong. This healthy confidence differs fundamentally from the unearned certainty of those caught in the Dunning-Kruger trap. One empowers action while accommodating reality. The other prevents growth by denying it. Which form of confidence guides your actions? Your challenge isn't eliminating confidence, but developing what psychologists call epistemic humility alongside self-efficacy. Confidence in your abilities paired with humility about your knowledge. This balanced approach acknowledges both capabilities and limitations, creating space for both action and learning. Can you think of someone who embodies this balance? What might you learn from them? The most insidious aspect of the Dunning-Kruger effect is its invisibility to those experiencing it. By definition, those most affected are least likely to recognize their condition. This creates your central challenge. How do you overcome a bias that blinds you to its own existence? Your first step is acknowledging universal vulnerability. No one, regardless of intelligence or education, is immune to overestimating abilities in domains where they lack expertise. Accepting this universal susceptibility creates cognitive space to question your certitude, especially in unfamiliar territories. What domains might you be overconfident in right now? Practical strategies begin with active feedback seeking, particularly from genuine experts. External assessment provides the objective perspective that self-assessment often lacks. However, this requires genuine openness to criticism and temporary suspension of defensive reactions. Not easy tasks when your self-image feels threatened. When was the last time you actively sought critical feedback? Deliberate practice, focused specifically on areas of weakness, helps align perceived and actual ability. Critical here is the feedback loop. Practice without clear, immediate feedback may actually reinforce overconfidence rather than correct it. As author Anders Ericsson demonstrated in his research on expertise, it's not practice, but deliberate practice with feedback that develops mastery. How might you incorporate more deliberate practice into your learning? Perhaps most challenging, but most effective, is cultivating comfort with uncertainty, developing the intellectual courage to say, "I don't know," when appropriate. Modern society often rewards quick answers and confident assertions over thoughtful consideration. Resisting this pressure requires deliberate effort and often a supportive community that values intellectual honesty over performative certainty. How comfortable are you with uncertainty? Our exploration of the Dunning-Kruger effect reveals a profound paradox at the heart of human knowledge. The more you learn, the more you recognize how much you don't know. As your circle of knowledge expands, so too does your perimeter of contact with the unknown. This paradox creates the counterintuitive trajectory we've explored, from the unearned confidence of novices to the calibrated uncertainty of experts. Understanding this effect offers you a powerful lens for intellectual growth and deeper human connection. It helps you approach disagreements with greater charity, recognizing that overconfidence often stems not from arrogance, but from the very structure of knowledge acquisition. It encourages you to cultivate both the confidence to act and the humility to learn. In a world increasingly fragmented by certainty, where confident voices offering simplified answers dominate public discourse, awareness of this cognitive bias becomes invaluable. It helps you distinguish between hollow confidence and earned expertise, both in yourself and others. It reminds you that wisdom begins not with certainty, but with the recognition of complexity. As philosopher Søren Kierkegaard wrote, "Anxiety is the dizziness of freedom." Similarly, uncertainty is the vertigo of genuine knowledge, uncomfortable but essential for intellectual growth. By embracing this discomfort, by acknowledging the limits of your understanding while continuing to expand it, you take the first step in transcending the very bias we've been exploring. The deepest irony of the Dunning-Kruger effect may be this: only by accepting how little you know can you truly begin to learn. And perhaps that's the most valuable wisdom of all. So ask yourself, where might you be blind to your own ignorance? And what new worlds of understanding might open up once you acknowledge these blind spots?